I'm Bob Doyle, the information philosopher, webcasting to you from my ITV studio in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Let me transition over to my closer camera here. And I have behind me our topic for the free will lecture. My 9th week of lectures on Tuesday now includes a discussion of the many philosophical positions that are out there among philosophers on the free will problem. It's quite amazing. Just as there are a very large number of interpretations of quantum mechanics, there's also an equally large number of positions on the problem of free will that are defended these days by different philosophers in different schools, you might say, or little cliques who work together and support one another. So when you have a large number of interpretations of quantum mechanics, obviously they all cannot be true. And the same situation applies to those people who think they have an answer to the free will problem. Fundamental disagreements with one another means only one of them could be true at most, and maybe none of them are true. In fact, I'm rather pessimistic about the arguments that are made, and I find that most philosophers today, and there are many who have written on free will, I have dozens and dozens and dozens of them on my website, informationphilosopher.com, especially on the drop-down menu for freedom or free will. And what I want to say is that most of them are really trying to defend moral responsibility of human beings, which is a reasonable thing for philosophers to do. After all, they're supposed to give us their non-religious in principle, non-scientific, because moral questions are not resolvable in terms of science. But their goal is to give us some defenses of their ideas on how moral responsibility is there for human beings. So, quite surprisingly, the way they deal with moral responsibility is half of them more or less deny it. They say that the nature of the physical world is such that everything in the physical world is being determined or controlled by natural forces. And if you have listened into my three-stage argument of how it is the universe came into existence, and how it formed the galaxies, stars, and planets, following those laws of physics, to that extent, philosophers are correct that objects like stars and planets, purely material objects, are in fact under the control of the laws of physics. They are not under the control of anything like a cosmic mind or a panpsychist mind. They are doing something which is forming themselves under gravitational forces at that 400 million year point when the universe began to light up again, or all the way back at more or less time zero in the first tiny fractions of a second when the first elementary particles, the quarks, began to combine into protons and neutrons, the so-called baryons. And that was a step in the direction of making little information structures, which of course is the key to my attempt to explain everything. But those baryons, the protons, the neutrons, and later when they formed with electrons to make atoms, much later, long beyond past the origin, in the order of 380,000 years is when the atoms finally formed. That whole first kind of stage, which I regard as the matter stage of our universe. The creation of matter I can defend and explain in terms of information structures, but these information structures I call passive because they do not involve information managing them in any way. Whereas the life stage, which is the second stage in my model, we now have information structures, namely the molecules or macromolecules that are able to replicate themselves by means we do not understand long before we do understand today's cells, which are able to replicate themselves and so forth in this magnificent separation of the DNA strands, and each strand forms a brand new double strand and then creates another cell. Two cells become out of one cell. That we all understand, and what's going on there is in life, in living things, we have the information structures contain a kind of programming. They contain a kind of information management ability. It's an information processing. I'm still struggling for kind of a word that would combine all of those aspects. But the way to describe it best is that living things use information, abstract information, like that encoded in the DNA, or encoded all the way down in the proteins that are being built out of a ribosome, or the little ATP synthase motors spinning so incredibly. They know how to rebuild themselves when we need more, and they use information to do it. And so I regard them as active information structures. And they are not particularly under the control of gravity, nor are they particularly under the control of nuclear forces. Those two have little to do with it. They are, however, very importantly involving or controlling electromagnetic forces, electrostatic forces that are needed to bind molecules together out of atoms and cell walls, and our neurons, which are moving ions, calcium ions, and sodium ions back and forth across the cell wall in a neuron, and creating the so-called active potentials, which send signals down on neurons and record information in what I call the experience recorder and reproducer. So the key message we want to look at today is that those philosophers, and most of them are analytic language philosophers, and they tend to boast or have a goal of doing clear conceptual analysis. They like to think that their clear thinking can lead them to truths about the world. And of course, I don't believe that words or logic or anything of that sort can actually give us knowledge about reality, because in order to do reality, we have to go out and do experiments and find out what the world is doing. We can't sit in an ivory tower, as Thomas Aquinas hoped, and figure out the world by reason alone. You have to go out and do experiments, which give us the statistics needed to inform our probabilities, and it turns out that our laws of nature are fundamentally and deeply statistical and predict probabilities. Theories make predictions, experiments then either confirm or deny the theories. Similarly, probabilities are predictions. Quantum mechanics makes probabilities, predictions about the probabilities for each of all the possibilities that the quantum experiments can reach to, and then we do experiments which give us the statistics. I'm repeating this quite often because it's surprising how little philosophers and even philosophers of science seem to deeply appreciate the difference between our theories and our experiments, between our probability predictions and our experimental statistical results. So these philosophers who have so many different positions, I want to point out that the free will section of my Information Philosopher website, let's just bring that up here, perhaps on this screen, and I'll enlarge it a couple of times. And here we are on the Information Philosopher website. I'll go here to bring it up full screen. And what I'm talking about are the one drop-down menu under the subject of free will. And you see I have a discussion of the problem, the history of the problem, my two-stage model of free will, which I trace back to William James and about a dozen or two others, the physics involved, the biology, the neuroscience, and then some very technical issues like moral responsibility that we're speaking about right now. So these philosophers, I'm going to argue, are primarily interested in moral responsibility. Some of them, many of them, go so far as to say that free will, the problem, is moral responsibility, that they're actually trying to solve whether or not we can be morally responsible. And more than half of them don't think there is any moral responsibility if we are determined, because the determinism means that everything that's happening has been caused by causal chains going back in time and forward in time, so there's only one future. So what I'm going to do is have you try to focus in on those who actually deny moral responsibility and those who accept it and think they're proving it, when I feel that the problem of free will has to do with whether or not determinism is true in the universe. It distinctly is not true according to quantum physics. And if it is not true, then there's true randomness in the universe. And if there's true randomness, many of these philosophers say, oh, that can't be. How could that be? If things are random, then that means we are random. And if we're random, we can't be, if our actions are random, we can't be responsible. And of course, I'm trying to get you to focus on the fact that most philosophers want to achieve and establish moral responsibility. Now, of course, they can't really tell us what exactly constitutes moral actions and responsible actions and so forth, because moral responsibility is basically handed to us by studies which are cultural, social, humanistic. The fact that we think we are morally responsible has to be taken to be the rules for moral actions. And those have been very different from society to society, and even more different from one age to another. What constitutes normal, reasonable moral behavior today is very different from what obtained, let's say, 10,000 years ago when we were forming language and developing agriculture, but we were treating a lot of people brutally by, the history of behavior of human beings and human societies has been shown, especially by Steve Pinker in his marvelous book on the better angels of our nature. It's been centuries of really destructive behavior, massive numbers of deaths at the village level, at the little tribal level, and doesn't rise to the global level we saw in the 20th century with World War I and II and the Civil War in the 19th. It's a sad picture, but an improving picture. I'm looking forward to Steve's new book, Enlightenment Now, that I've pre-ordered from Amazon. But what I'm saying is, it's clear that moral responsibility is not something we can establish on scientific grounds. When I was an undergraduate at Brown, as a physics student, I was required to take a course in ethics, and the main purpose of the course in ethics was to drill into my head that science has absolutely nothing to say about ethics. And that struck me as something questionable. At a minimum, assuming that we did have ethical rules, moral rules, that were saying this is good and that is bad, assuming we had them, it seemed to me science would at least come in the form of engineering or technology that would improve our abilities to achieve the good. For example, if it's bad to let people starve, the answer might be to improve their well-being, we would need to develop some new technology, some new means of providing the wherewithal, providing sustenance to those who are not as well off as they might be. So I've always had an idea there's something wrong with denying a role for science and or technology in ethical questions, in moral questions. But I'll come back to that. I do, though, deeply think that science, in particular quantum mechanics, and its strange randomness, which I believe is likely to produce a lot of noise in recalling information from our minds, can contribute what William James called alternative probabilities, alternative action possibilities, and therefore contribute to a break of the causal chain going back into the past, and give our will phase, our deliberation phase, when we evaluate the alternative possibilities, and allow us to be agents in the sense that we make the what I call adequately determined decision or choice between the possibilities, but the fact that they were thought up in our heads and maybe involve randomness in no way makes us random. We are the ones who select one of those possibilities, and in the selection that becomes our thought, it becomes our action. We focus our attention on a blooming, buzzing confusion of possibilities, as James described it. And when we make that evaluation and then make that decision and then go ahead with the action that follows, we are the causative agent of that action. It in no way has been caused by the randomness that was involved in putting up new possibilities for what we might do. That's my model, my two-stage model. And so what I'd like to do is explore this website here that I've got up on the screen, and show you that when I do click on free will, let's just click there, we go to the freedom section. What I want you to see here is, just a moment, I'll go back and remind you of what's on the left-hand side here. What's on the left-hand side normally is a large number of philosophers, right? 200 some philosophers that I've studied and provided a critical analysis of their thinking, plus resources in the form of journal articles or quotes from their books. So instead of me talking about them, which is the sort of typical work in philosophy, I provide you a lot of their original material, the material that I think provides you an understanding of what each of these philosophers is doing. But now if I go back and I go over to the freedom section where we have philosophers here, let me take that to full screen for just a moment, where there are philosophers this here, okay, what we're going to do is now see that when we select on the free will section, the philosophers changes to core concepts. I wonder if I can bump this up a lot. I think so, in which I can then show you the kind of concepts that these philosophers have been telling us about. And these are the concepts involved in freedom. Actualism, adequate determinism, a causus sui, a self-causing cause, the idea of a causal closure, causalism and causality, certainty, chance, chaos theory, compatibilism, my cogito model, complexity and conceptual analysis, and could have done otherwise, and creativity and determination as opposed to determinism, so-called double effect, either way, emergent determinism, the fact that it does emerge, many, many things. The free will axiom, free will in antiquity, free will mechanisms and requirements, and so forth. A great deal of work has been done here, and it's all out there for you, those of you, very few, probably at this point in time, no one is going to go in and study the details of all of these particular ways of talking and working with the problem of free will. But I've been building them for years, and they're there, and I hope they'll be there, still on the web, when I'm gone, if I can succeed in getting my sons or some other organization to keep my informationphilosopher.com website alive. Now, besides all of these pages, each page has a lot of work on it. Is it a pseudo problem here? Can we do this differently? Can we act differently in the same original circumstances? The answer is yes. All of these ideas involve a great deal of jargon in the world of those schools or tribes or different groups who write about quantum mechanics. I'm sorry, right about free will. And what I've done there is to create a taxonomy. Let me bring that up for a moment onto our screen here. I've created a taxonomy which identifies by name the different schools who argue. Let me take that to full screen for just a moment and we'll talk about them a little bit. Basically, I divided on the left determinism and on the right indeterminism. And going down one side, let me take that back to this view for just a moment. Basically, I've got determinism on the right, on the left, and indeterminism on the right. I think you see that way. So down this side, things involve the possibility of randomness making a contribution to the problem of free will. And over on this side is the area that most philosophers are more happy with. I put determinism at the top, and just below it I say that they like to believe that free will, in their definition of free will, is compatible with determinism. So they imagine a deterministic universe in which everything is determined to happen, and there's little that we can do about stopping it happening and getting something different to happen. They like this compatibilism, and it's something that William James called soft determinism, as opposed to hard determinism. And the distinction he was making there has always been an important one as we come down below, because we see that those people who are soft determinists often think they can get away with something that's called SemiCompatibilism, for example, and various narrow and broad and soft and so forth, modest libertarianism all sit in this area. However, on the hard determinism side, we have things like hard incompatibilism, which is to say that free will doesn't exist, and therefore there's no moral responsibility, because determinism is totally incompatible with free will. Then we have schools of illusionism, of impossibilism, that moral responsibility then is impossible. And then I've got an arrow coming down from compatibilism down towards Dan Dennett's Valerian model, which is a two-stage model like mine, except that Dan does not believe in any real quantum randomness, any ontological randomness in the universe. He's happy enough with just the kind of randomness that you can get out of a computer generating pseudo-random numbers, which has been a thing that Dan has been studying for decades, going back to Alan Newell and Herbert Simon, who had a model of a computer that could solve problems, and it would generate possible solutions at random using pseudo-random numbers, and then possibly they'd get a proof of one of their theorems out of that. But that is a failed idea, in my opinion, because it's still just determinism. So it's compatible with free will, but it is not free will in my mind, if it's the case that we are not involved, that we are not in charge, and that we are not the authors of our lives, which is one way of putting that. So with this diagram, I, at the bottom, argue for my two-stage model, okay, of a limited sort of determinism in the evaluation, which means it's not predetermined what we are going to decide. There were those who said, oh, well, if you generate a lot of possibilities, you are still going to be predetermined to choose one of them. And that's an interesting argument, but it's simply not the case, because we have what I call an adequate determinism, or a limited determinism, which is not predetermined, okay? It is instead enough determinism to avoid making that choice at random. The idea that the choice has random in it is the idea that the indeterminism comes in at the end and chooses for us between multiple possibilities. And there's a narrow school around Bob Kane who argues that that's the key idea to his self-forming action. I won't go into that at the present time, but it's something we'll get back to again when we feature Bob Kane as our philosopher on a Wednesday. So I point out here, let's come back to this one, this is our blog page, which I hope you've been learning. You can go to the blog page at i-phi.org and always see the lecture that's up for today. And under this taxonomy, I point out that hard and soft determinism were terms invented by William James, who lamented the fact that some determinists were co-opting the term freedom for themselves. He called them soft determinists because, he said, abhorring harsh words like fatality, necessity, and even predetermination, they say determinism's real name is freedom. For freedom, they say, is only necessity understood, and bondage to the highest, that is to say God, is identical with true freedom. So let me come back here and put this one up here. Now there's a long list here of definitions, and they are also available on the website. So I'll remind you that you go to informationphilosopher.com/freedom, and there's a page on the taxonomy, and let's go over here for a moment and over here for a bigger view of this as I scroll up and look at this page. Just under the taxonomy, I have determinism defined, hard and soft determinism defined. What do hard determinists think? Compatibilism, SemiCompatibilists, hard incompatibilists, illusionists, impossibilists, and then incompatibilism, and so forth, several more. There's an important development that occurred in the 1960s or so, at a time when compatibilists were very happy with their idea of free will, that somehow it can get along with determinism. There were those who worried that quantum effects might actually interfere with that, and they tried to reconcile that. And the time came when Peter van Wagon, another philosopher who was important and will feature in our discussions in the future, came along with the idea that he declared the problem with free will and determinism is not the problem. There's a paper out from the group that was funded by Templeton Foundation money under Al Mealy, who's a philosopher that I feature in one chapter of my free will book. There's an article in the results of this multi-million-dollar study of free will under Mealy's auspices. The title of the article is "The Problem of Free Will and Determinism is Not the Problem of Free Will and Determinism." I love that title. It seems to me it's just typical and emblematic, or symptomatic, we might say, of language philosophers. Sounds very Derridian or Hegelian, or it can be A and not A. I mean, it's this, but it's not that, and so forth. But what Peter van Wagen did, and I wonder if I have his page here somewhere. I'm going to say go here, and then on to my information philosopher. I'll show you what I'm doing. I'm working on this page, and there's my information philosopher. So I go there and open it up, and we got a great big screen here, but that might be helpful because we'll scroll down and we'll look for Peter van Wagen. Now, you know, much of what I'm doing in talking to you today is really because the work I'm doing is meant to be out there indefinitely, forever. And it's very difficult for me to get to say much in a 1-hour lecture, even though I'm now on my 42nd lecture, because there's a huge amount of material that's out on my website that I encourage any of you who's interested in any of these philosophers or in these philosophical problems that you'll spend some time going to my website. After all, I'm very critical of whether we can really do serious philosophy with language, and yet that's what I have to try to do here. So I'm going to go to Peter van Wagen, which is right here, And let's see, I need to shrink that back down a little bit so it'll fit on the page, and see if I can take it a little to the right of the screen, and maybe then we'll see the whole, whoops, don't want to do that. A little tricky. Here we go. And I'll make it a little smaller. So Peter, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do that. Oh, it's a little hard. I guess I'd do better if I went right here, move this over, and then just one back. He was, I describe him, I think correctly, as an intellectual giant in two major fields of philosophy. And I don't seem to be able to push this screen over to the side very well, so I'll come down a little bit. The problem of free will, and Peter is also, makes a materialist analysis of metaphysical problems. So he's a major player in my free will problem, and he's a big player in my metaphysics website. So one of the things he did, he made an enormous reputation for himself by bucking the trend among philosophers in most of the 20th century who argued that we should accept compatibilism, the idea that free will is compatible with a strict causal determinism. Indeed, Van and Wagon has been given credit for rehabilitating an idea of incompatibilism in the last few decades. He explains that the old problem of whether we have free will or whether determinism is true is no longer being debated. And he starts off with saying, the problem of free will and determinism in a way that will satisfy everyone is very difficult to create. So let's see if I can push this up a little bit and still have it show up on your screen. And it's something like now the idea that was in that Mealy paper, that the problem of free will and determinism is not the problem of free will and determinism. And Peter comes up with the statement, the problem is the problem between determinism and as a compatibilism, and the opposite, incompatibilism. Now, what had he done in this? It's quite interesting. I say he changed the subject, okay? Because he wants to talk about compatibilism versus incompatibilism. And he creates these two arguments, one of which is called the consequence argument, that if determinism or compatibilism, either one is true, then it must be that we have absolutely no freedom, and the past is determining everything that's happening today. Sounds to me like he's just restating the case against determinism, but he thinks it's different. And I was looking for a diagram that I made on Peter, but I don't see it here, and so that I'll skip away from that, and we'll go back to perhaps here, because I've come down to incompatibilism, which Peter has introduced. And if I go here, and if I go here, Peter's introduced this notion of incompatibilism as the key problem. Whoop, okay. Let's take that here. And so how can we think clearly about what he is doing, what Van and Wagon is doing, when he has compatibilism and incompatibilism? Because incompatibilists consist of two different groups, quite distinct, quite opposed. One is the one who says that libertarians who believe in free will must not belong to the compatibilist area. They are on this side and they're libertarians. On the other hand, there are those who don't believe there is any free will and that determinism is true, and they are what he called hard incompatibilists who deny moral responsibility. And so in the 70s, 80s, 90s, philosophy students who took a class in free will, they had to draw a diagram which said you must explain what compatibilism is and what incompatibilism is. And incompatibilism includes both people who believe they are free and responsible and people who don't believe there's any freedom or any responsibility. Seems to me that's a conceptual mess coming from an analytic language philosopher who's proud of their ability to think clearly and with concepts that are self-evident. Instead, Peter van Inwagen introduced this idea that that incompatibilism is a category, but unfortunately includes two opposite points of view within it. A lot of students failed their tests when they tried to explain that mess. And I think that what we need to do with that is take it back to the situation. Let me just look at my diagram again for a moment. And this one, and take that to full screen again, and say that the idea of this incompatibilism, which is in yellow here, and this point right here in the middle, is a very difficult thing to imagine, because as you see, the lines come down. The other yellow on this page is basically the idea that that hard incompatibilism over on the left, let me come out to my screen here, points you to, by deciding incompatibilism is the category that Van Inwagen wants to have, he has to include all these incompatibilisms, and over here, hard incompatibilism, which means there's no moral responsibility. There's typically a narrow and broad incompatibilism, or what some call SemiCompatibilism, is meant to say something like this. Well, free will may not be compatible with determinism, but moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. Or maybe they deny that. The moral responsibility, those who deny that moral responsibility is compatible with determinism are people who are impossibilists or illusionists, and there are several people in that group, or those who believe that incompatibilism is compatible with determinism. Sorry to roll out this buzzwords one after the other, but these people who are called semi-compatibilists say, well, it may not be compatible, free will may not be compatible with determinism, but we can be morally responsible. So that's the morally responsible people here, and those who think morally responsibility does not exist over here. So let's come back to this screen and work our way down. Incompatibilists, different kinds, and so forth, and libertarians, and so forth. So what I'd like to show you is that a large part of the work has been to find ourselves with all of these categories, not categories, but separate pages on the subjects. For example, ultimate responsibility, you see there. Perhaps I can bring that up on my other screen, which will help for you to see it a little bit better, way at the top of this page. It's amazing how many. I'll go here, switch to this one for you. Here we are again with our many web pages or concepts. These are, again, if you're going to be a good conceptual analyst, you need to be able to work with the concepts that are out there. And so besides providing you with this long possibility list of web pages to study, besides giving you that, okay, and there's a lot there to study. Look at that, Laplace's demon. It's already a wonderful subject for a paper, certainly a good undergraduate paper, and maybe even graduate students should be able to criticize this sort of thinking and why people take it seriously. Here's the notion of moral necessity as opposed to moral responsibility, and the moral sentiments which come down to us from David Hume. All very interesting questions. So when you do read one of these papers, one of these pages, naturalism is the idea the natural laws are there and we can't resist them because they control the whole universe. What I've done then is to give you a glossary. Let me go back to make another copy of my my web page here for a moment and see if I can find that glossary. I'm working on this screen, and I'm expanding Information Philosopher again as I do. You'll see up at the top there's a link to my lectures, which is a big array of 8 weeks of lectures. Let's briefly look at that. You see I'm on my 9th week actually, and I've planned the lectures for the rest of the week. Let's go back again. And I'm showing you that up in the drop-down menus area, here's the drop-down menu for freedom, for example. In that area, just below it, I've got links to my blog, which contains each day's lecture, and over here the lecture link, and here a glossary link. Let's just take a look at that. And it's something I'd like you to get familiar with. Now, on the left side, I still have my drop-down of all the philosophers, but in here, this is a massive glossary of terms. And here, what I've done, here's the concept of being a causal agent, for example. And let me take that up here for just a moment. And I need to have this screen up for us. So here's the causal agent. And what I've done with this glossary, I believe, is a sort of unique contribution. I've built the glossaries for a number of problem areas inside my Information Philosopher website. For example, there's a glossary of all the terms that are used by Terry Deacon. Terence Deacon is a neurobiologist and an anthropologist and a linguist and a major player at University of California, Berkeley. He's invited me to conferences on biosemiosis, and a very interesting thinker. I got asked by Bioscience magazine to review his latest book called Incomplete Nature, How the Mind Emerges from Matter. And so our interests greatly overlap, because I'm trying to tell you that I see these 3 stages of the development of matter, and then the development of life, and then the development of mind. So in 3 stages. Terry tries to jump rather quickly from matter into mind. So the subtitle of his book is how mind emerges from matter. I think that's the subtitle. Well, Terry has an enormous list of newly developed terms, neologisms, and so I made a great glossary of about 40 of his terms to help you reading that book, and to help me so that I could review it for Bioscience magazine. I also made a glossary for the postmodern deconstructionist philosopher Jacques Derrida, and it's really almost impossible to understand their work without understanding the idea that they've created new words with special meanings, and they do provide you a great deal of insight in most cases. That's why I felt it was important to make them. So what I'm showing you here is my glossaries are quite unusual, this one anyway, in that every single definition, like agent causal, also includes links to glosses, and I'm going to point at them right here, other glosses to, for example, alternative possibilities, to causality itself and the self-caused cause called causa sui, event causal versus agent causal. That's a very important distinction. So when you read this definition, you can think about it, and maybe I've got it all here, but if I haven't, you can go to adjoining terms that frame the meaning of this term in the context of these others. So I've built you this very powerful glossary. Let me, since I'm on this for just a moment, maybe I'll do this on the big screen, my other screen here, and scroll us down away from all these problem pages in free will, which is proof of so many problem areas and philosophers with different problems. And I'll just scroll down to, here's Jacques Derrida, right? Let's just take a look at this for a moment and see what it looks like when I create a glossary for someone like Derrida. First of all, there's a lot of work on his page, and I probably need to shrink this a little bit so you can see more of it. But as I go down, I eventually get to, here's my gloss quickly of all of these terms: the abyss, alterity, All was already, that's a Husserl and Hegelian term, and the blanc, the space, the phallic pen disseminates, and so forth. I hope you'll have fun with this. I had a lot of fun with this. I read a lot of Derrida, tried to read a reasonable amount in French, where he's even more playful. This is one of his really important terms. And then I wanted to go down, since I'm in science, just let me show you Terence Deacon. And click it again. There we go. And shrink it again a little bit here. And let's go down and see what I've done for a glossary. Look at all this writing about Deacon. Did a lot of work on this fellow. And eventually we get to more quotes, long quotes from his work. I don't believe you can understand him without reading a good deal. But now here, this is a glossary I built to understand the book Complete Nature. There's his absential, which is something absence of Derrida, the attractor, an important term in chaos and complexity theory, autocatalysis, the idea that its chemical reactions can create something greater than the things that go into them, the collectively autocatalytic, and so forth. An autogen is his term for something which can self-generate itself, autogenesis, various entropy issues, complexity and chaos theory, and so forth, cybernetics, emergence. There's a heck of a lot in this fellow. And of course, these are general terms which are over in my regular glossary, but in this one, they're there for you to understand the thinking of Terry Deacon. So I'll go back to the glossary I built in general, and then I want to go back to our philosophers, free will. Where am I? How about, let's see, this one. As I work my way through all these definitions, again, a similar effort on my part to give you the tools to appreciate what they're arguing about. Perhaps the most important in many ways, see if I'm on the left like this, come back out a moment. The flagship carrier for the idea that that free will is not compatible with the determinism that we have, and so we've got here a hard incompatibilist or an impossibilist. I'd just like to mention a couple of these thinkers that are the most important, and so ones that we'll try to deal with in future weeks during my Wednesday lecture. One of those is Galen Strawson, who's the son of Peter Strawson. Sir Peter famously is another person like Van Inwagen who changed the subject and tried to get the conversation to be different. Sometime in the 1960s, I believe, Sir Peter wrote an essay called, what is it called? Resentment and Freedom, or Freedom and Resentment, or something like this. And what he's doing there is focusing on the fact that even if we had no free will, knowing what we are like, studying our behaviors and looking at people and the way they behave, what they're, Sir Peter said, there's no way, even if the world was completely determined, that I wouldn't react to bad behaviors with a feeling that I should be blaming them. And if it's me, I should blame myself, and so forth. And on the other hand, if I see good things happening, they should be praiseworthy. So praise and blame, he described as the kind of attitudes we automatically produce when we react to these kinds of actions or events happening in the world along the spectrum from good to evil. He actually said, I don't understand the problem of free will and determinism. Now, that may have been just a ruse to get you going, because I think he does know a great deal about it, and I thought he understood a reasonable amount about science, but he chose to say, forget all that, it's just a question of how we react. And that's a good way to describe what moral responsibility is, because it's been sort of evolved into us to behave in this way. So he was like a behaviorist who taking seriously looking at what we do rather than what we say or even what we know, because he didn't think we knew enough about science and freedom and determinism to say which of those was true in the world, or scientific terms, which of those is experimentally has evidence to support it. But Peter Strawson's son, quite strangely, decides we may think that way, we may react that way, but the fact of the matter is that there's a basic argument he puts forward that every single event that ever happened in our lives and before our lives can be traced back to one of two possibilities. Either that event was determined, end of story. If it's all determined, we're determined, no moral responsibility, according to Galen, the son. On the other hand, we can trace it possibly to an event that was a random event. And so goes the argument. If it's random, surely we can't take responsibility for it. If it's random, an action that's random by me is not something I can say, well, I deserve the blame or I deserve the credit. I deserve the praise. So there you have a card-carrying impossibilist, and he wrote an essay called The Impossibility of Moral Responsibility. And he's written this and spoken about it many, many times. There are others who are in that category, and let's see if I wanted to mention another one. Derek Perboom is another who has written a book called Learning to Live Without Free Will, and so forth. There are quite a few of them, and I'll take them up again sometime. But on the other side, there are those who say, well, I accept determinism. It seems to be the case. It seems to be that the world is deterministic. The laws of nature are solid. The naturalists believe that they see that is what is making everything happen. And on that side, there are some who are wanting to say, but it's still compatible with moral responsibility. And there are a couple of ways to argue about it. Dan Dennett, of course, is famous for this view. He actually says free will is moral responsibility. So like Peter Strawson, sidestepping the question of what science is telling us in free will, straight to the question that even if we're all robots, and he's sort of, Dan Dennett has a view that we're sort of, minds are computers, our bodies are machines, and everything's happening according to laws of machines, laws of material. But we can say that we are moral agents, that we can learn to behave in a competent, morally competent way, and that constitutes enough freedom for him. He calls it the free will worth wanting. He says this libertarian free will, where something can, in his view, break with the law of nature, be like a miracle in his view, that free will isn't possible. But it's not a problem, says Dan, because we can be morally responsible, and that is free will. And even Bob Kane says it's the traditional definition of free will. So now we have the positions of the incompatibilists who deny any moral responsibility, and those who say, well, maybe we do have, free will and determinism are incompatible with one another, but moral responsibility and determinism are not incompatible. They are compatible. So they tend to be called SemiCompatibilist. We'll come back to our screen here for just a moment and bring that up again. Oh, I've got it already. You see the idea of semi-compatibilism here somewhere. Let me put it up in the big screen. Off to our this side of the screen, we've got those who think, nope, no moral responsibility because of incompatibilism. But over here, we've got these incompatibilists who are willing to accept, and especially the semi-compatibilists who say, not compatible, free will is not compatible, but moral responsibility is compatible with determinism. And the lead scholar in that area is Professor John Martin Fisher, who's in California, University of Riverside, as I remember, and he's been a prolific author of many books and pulled together a 4-volume collection of articles on free will, which is a spectacular $1,500 set of books, which I have, thanks to Widener Library letting me renew them year after year. And I'm going to make John Martin Fisher the subject of our discussion tomorrow. But let's see if I have something about him that I'd like to say today. I'll go back to our diagram. I'm here on the diagram, and see if there's anyone else that have different points of view. The idea of modest libertarianism is the work of Alfred Mealy, and Mealy, like Dennett and Bob Kane, have chapters in my book. This one, if I open it up, you'll see that I decided I would take 4 particular persons as sort of representatives of the various positions. Ted Honderich is a British philosopher, English philosopher, who for many years ran the Institute of Philosophy that had been originally founded by Bertrand Russell. And he fully accepts determinism, hard determinism, as we saw that William James had claimed, and there is no freedom, there is no moral responsibility, they're all not possible. And then I followed the study of that hard determinist with Bob Kane's libertarianism, and then I have a chapter on, I think next is Dan Dennett's compatibilism. And finally I rounded it off with this compromising person who describes himself as agnostic on the question of whether a free will exists, whether it's compatible or not. I think he leans towards saying it's compatible, but he calls it a modest libertarianism. He thinks there's a little room. So there in this book, and mind you, this book is entirely up there on the web, so you can go to informationphilosopher.com and find at the top a link to my books, I hope. Let's see, I'm going to try to put this up for the moment. Here we are on the website again. We're way down at the bottom. You see all those authors on the left, which I've been very happy to build these all for you. I hope some of you who go on to be young, budding philosophers and come to teach, I believe, a better understanding of a lot of the philosophical problems that at the moment are not being solved. And I believe, in particular, the free will is being taught in a way that it shouldn't be taught. I regard it as a scandal in philosophy, which you'll see from the subtitle of my book. And so I hope you'll be able to help with this problem in the long run. But here I wanted to go to my books, and where's my mouse? Right here. Click on books. Here are my 3 books that are out now. I've got another one coming. But here is Free Will, The Scandal in Philosophy, and those chapters on Dennett, on Kane, on Honderich and Mealy are all down the bottom, but lots of other pages on the history of free will and all the determinisms, the compatibilisms, and so forth are here for you to simply download. So if we wanted to see the story on Dan Dennett, we'd simply click here, and the Dan Dennett chapter opens for you, and you're able to read it right away. Let me push it up a little bit here. I'm hoping you enjoy this work, which I've been doing, and to me it's all a gift to me, myself, because I reuse it in other work I do in my talks, but it's primarily written for those who survive me, and I hope you will find it very useful in the future. So let me turn on a little closing music here and get ready to sign off on this Tuesday lecture on free will, the many different positions that philosophers hold. They cannot all be true. It may be that none of them are really the case, but we'll continue to study it, and I hope I'll be able to give you an argument for what I regard as the best description of the free will problem, or the problem of reconciling human free will with determinism. So here's my topic poster page today, and thank you very much for being with me. Goodbye, till tomorrow.